In the early 1900s, Florence McLellan was locked away in an asylum, not because she was insane, but because society deemed her morally defective. Her crime? Ha, that was just having a child out of wedlock. The baby was taken from her and she was sent to Brockhall Asylum, a place designed to house those the authorities wanted hidden from sight. But Florence refused to disappear. She escaped and she fled to London and changed her name and built a new life for herself. But she spent the rest of her days in fear, always looking over her shoulder, terrified that she would be dragged back to that asylum. So today I'm heading to Brockhall's forgotten graveyard, where so many women like Florence were abandoned and didn't escape and ended up buried there. Their stories just gone forever, but their voices definitely deserve to be heard. Brockhall Asylum opened in 1904 as a place for people considered mentally defective. At first, it was meant for those with severe disabilities, but it quickly became a place where society locked away anyone seen as a problem, including women like Florence. Women who had simply had a child outside of marriage. In 1913, the Mental Deficiency Act made it even easier to send people to asylums. Under this law, authorities could classify someone as an idiot, an imbecile, or just plain old feeble-minded, or even a moral defective, a vague label often given to unmarried mothers or women who didn't fit social norms. No longer was a doctor's signature needed to commit someone. Once sent to a place like Brockhall, there was little chance of ever being released. And many of the people locked away here weren't actually ill, they were just unwanted. And it was usually working class women who suffered this fate. Wealthier families had the means to quietly send a pregnant daughter away to distant relatives or discreet maternity homes, or even off abroad somewhere until the baby was born and given away to someone else. But for the poor or the working class women, there were fewer options. If their families couldn't support them, or they were just left to fend for themselves, or it was too shameful to have them at home, they became easy targets for a system that saw them simply as a problem to be locked away rather than help. Can you imagine what it must have felt like? You're just a young girl and suddenly everything you know is torn away from you and you're locked behind cold white walls and labelled as defective. And you imagine the fear and the confusion and the heartbreak, the cries of the other inmates echoing through the walls, and the knowledge that you might be stuck here forever. That this place, this institution could become your whole world. That was the reality for countless women who were just trapped and forgotten, and their stories buried with them. The Mental Deficiency Act wasn't even repealed until 1957, after years of civil liberties campaigns, and when it was finally abolished, about 2,000 inmates, including those who'd been unjustly detained for nothing more than being pregnant out of wedlock, were released. And it makes you think, what happened to these women? And were they ever able to rebuild their lives after such a harsh punishment? And how many more suffered in silence while the law just held them captive? In the 1970s, there were some shocking newspaper reports that came out about women who'd spent most of their adult lives locked away simply for just having a child out of wedlock. Forgotten for decades, they were suddenly thrust into a world that had long since moved on without them. Can you even imagine just how scary and terrifying it must be? And how many of them ever actually found peace? And then even worse, how many of them never got that chance at all? So who was Florence McLellan? Well, she was just a regular young woman when her life was suddenly turned upside down. She came from a modest family, and like many women of her time, she was expected to follow strict rules about how to live. But when she became pregnant outside of marriage, well, everything changed. Society in those days saw this as something that was really shameful, and instead of helping her, her family handed her over to the authorities. Her baby was taken away from her, and the men in white coats came to escort her to Brockhall Asylum. Now, when she arrived inside the asylum, Florence was surrounded by the misery of the other patients, and the cries that echoed through the walls and the corridors. I mean, some people there were truly unwell, but many, like her, had simply been cast aside by society. And despite the horror of the place, the doctors and nurses quickly realised that Florence wasn't really mentally ill. And instead of treating her like a patient, they put her to work in the staff canteen, cooking and cleaning for the very people who kept her locked there in the first place. But Florence, she was a strong girl, and she never stopped looking for a way out. And one day, an opportunity came her way. A kitchen delivery arrived, and in the chaos of everyone unloading the supplies, she saw her chance. The gate had been left open, so her heart pounding, she slipped away unnoticed, running as fast as she could and throwing her apron behind her and leaving Brockhall behind forever. And do you know, she did. She made it all the way to London, but she didn't by any means have an easy life after that. She had to find work, as she had no family, no home, and no official identity. She had to figure out how to survive. She made it to London, but life there was anything but easy. With no family, no home, and no official identity, she had to survive on her own. Eventually, she changed her name to Diane to avoid being tracked down and found. And she did work wherever she could, cleaning houses, scrubbing floors, and doing what needed to be done to earn a little bit of money. Angel Islington became her new home because she just really loved the name, Angel Islington. But she was always looking over her shoulder, terrified that one day someone was going to find her. The authorities were going to figure out where she was and they were going to drag her back to that asylum. And for the rest of her life, Florence lived in absolute fear, knowing that if she was caught, there would be no escape. She would never get out of there a second time. But despite everything, that Florence still managed to build a life for herself, a life that was stolen from so many other women who were treated the same, other women who never got that chance to be able to run. And Florence eventually built a lovely life in London. She met a kind man who accepted her past, and together they had 2 more sons. But no matter how much time passed, the fear of being discovered never ever truly went away. She had escaped Brockhall, but the trauma of what happened remained with her, trapped with her. And then decades later, well, the unexpected happened, or Florence's worst nightmare happened. Florence, now 77 years old, received a phone call that would change absolutely everything. The police had finally tracked her down, but not to send her back, but to reconnect her with the family that she'd lost so many years before. Her relatives had spent years fearing the worst when she disappeared from the asylum, believing that she'd died inside the asylum and nobody had told them. But DNA tests ruled out tragic cases that were found buried underground, and an extensive police investigation actually did lead them to Islington in North London, where Florence had been living all along. And most incredible of all is that Florence discovered that the son that she was forced to give up all them years ago, Joseph Norman Bell, had been living just 10 miles away from her all that time in London. And after more than 60 years apart, mother and son were finally reunited. And Joseph and Florence have both since sadly passed away, but their story is the reminder of the cruelty that so many women faced and the strength that it took to survive. Florence spent most of her life living in fear, yet in the end she reclaimed a piece of what had been stolen from her. So after Brockhall Hospital's closure in 1992, the cemetery, which is right here where many former residents were buried, faced a really uncertain future. Because initially the Regional Health Authority and the Brockhall management team approached St Leonard's Church regarding the cemeteries and the management of the cemetery, but the church declined, citing concerns over maintaining the cemetery separately due to its association with the asylum's former residents. So basically the church weren't interested and didn't want anything to do with it, even though it's literally right next door to them. The treatment of the individuals at Brockhall was influenced by societal attitudes, which often viewed those with learning difficulties or perceived moral failings as burdens to society or a threat to society. And this led to policies and practices that marginalised and isolated those individuals. So there's a lot of broader societal prejudice of the time, and after the hospital's closure, the cemetery where many former residents were buried faced an uncertain future. So initially, St. Leonard's Church said that it didn't want to take on the management of this cemetery, even though it's right next door. They cited concerns over the people who were actually buried here from the asylum. So they said they didn't want anything to do with it, which left the cemetery to be sold as private land. And it was sold to a Mr. Gerald Hitman, who believed the cemetery was actually included in the sale of some land that's just behind it. So he erected this stone here right behind me, listing the names of all the deceased former residents, because he believed that everybody should be remembered, no matter where they were when they died. And many of these individuals have been buried in unmarked graves, and their identities in their stories were just forgotten here. But after he did this, it was later revealed that the cemetery had actually been sold separately to somebody else. So Mr. Hitman went along and he actually managed to repurchase the land again from him so that he could keep this land safe. And from then on, Mr. Hitman dedicated much of his life to preserving the memory of these forgotten individuals that are listed on here, and is actually now buried right alongside them in this cemetery. Final act of a man who just fought to ensure that the people who lived here, that their stories were remembered. And Florence's story is just one among many. The Mental Deficiency Act allowed thousands of women to be institutionalized, and not because they were dangerous, but just because society viewed them as inconvenient. Now, these days, Brockhall Asylum is gone, but this graveyard remains, and it's a reminder of those people who were forgotten. And the efforts of individuals like Gerald Hitman have ensured that these lives that were lost are not entirely erased from history, providing a nice, quiet space for reflection. And Florence McLellan's story is one of resilience and survival and heartbreak, and is a story shared by countless women who were locked away in institutions simply for just being deemed inconvenient by society. And though the world has changed, the scars of that time definitely still linger. Brockhall Asylum might be gone, but its graveyard still remains as a powerful reminder of those whose lives were forgotten until individuals like Gerald Hitman stepped in to ensure their stories were told. And when people search for heroic women of the UK, you can pretty much bet that Florence's name won't appear alongside the famous figures from history. But in her own way, she was just as brave, fighting not on a battlefield, but against a system that sought to just simply erase her and disappear her like she was nothing. And she, like so many others, endured unimaginable injustice, yet just refused to be broken. And her story just isn't one of just suffering, but of resilience and quiet defiance in the face of cruelty. You sit here in this old graveyard and you think about Florence's journey, it's important to remember that many people like her never ever had the chance to reclaim their identities. Her reunion with her son decades later, it gives hope for lost connections, but we must never ever forget how cruelly society treated those deemed simply different. And we have to ask ourselves how many more stories like Florence's are just there, still waiting to be told. And as someone who works with people with learning difficulties, I see firsthand how important it is for individuals to feel welcomed and valued in society. Everyone deserves to have a part to play and a sense of belonging, and that can make all the difference. Now, if you found Florence's story moving, please like this video and share it with others who might benefit from hearing about this lady. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think about how society treated women like Florence? And do you know of any similar stories? I would absolutely love to hear them in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe if you enjoyed today's episode. And remember, sometimes the most forgotten stories are the ones that do actually need to be told the most.